The story begins with the protagonist introducing himself as a Maou, the king of a labyrinth that feeds off people's emotions by creating dungeons, even though one would think of a heinous demon, a death awaiting at the end of desperation and fear. All of it might be true, but the dungeon he made is a city, while having none of the scary things all someone would think of when the word dungeon comes in their mind. In the past, one day the protagonist found himself in a confined place wondering who he is, and where he is only to find that a woman dressed up as some kind of boss is walking toward him with her dangerous monster. Just as the monster begins to berate him all the way possible by jumping all around him, he ends up creating a pistol out of nowhere by using his creation magic in desperation, and ends up splattering the monster's head on the ground like a smashed pumpkin. Soon enough, the monster disintegrates, and even the protagonist himself is flabbergasted to see that was able to make something like this happen. The woman comes in to explain that he has a skill that uses magic to realize some things from his memory, even though he cannot create something alive or coded in magic. Even before he is about to explain his situation or get a grasp of his own situation, the woman claims that he passed the test, and he is successfully about to be born as a new demon king with the name of Demon King Prosel. She even goes on to introduce herself as Marco, the Demon King of Beasts, and she is quite similar to him, who is one of the Demon Kings. When the protagonist asks her about her ability to know him, she claims that she doesn't know much other than what the higher-ups have already told her, and she thinks that it will be easier to show him than explain in the first place. Soon enough, she takes him to a confined room where a crystal is placed in the middle, and the moment he is able to look at his face, she asks him to hold it, as it is the only thing that gives her the source of her power, which is enough to make her crumble on the ground in an instant. Then when he asks if he has his own crystal, she thinks that he doesn't have one yet. But he doesn't have to worry, as the Demon Kings lead the demons to create dungeons and reign over them, so they can incite the humans to come inside of the dungeon. She explains that strong emotions and the power of life are the way they are able to collect dungeon points, and now he will have to start the beginning of his dungeon's creation, as he hears that demons are brought to life by combining two metals that can be made by a demon king once in a month. Even though Marco is able to spawn a beast that riles over beasts, while acquiring the fire metal to spawn a fire-governing demon, the protagonist's create metal can change the attribute of his metal to his liking, which gives him an endless option to select from. Even though he might feel like it is a pain in the ass to use 3 metals to make it happen, Macro is amazed to see that he can make it happen, and the moment he goes on to create a demon for the first time, he remembers that all he wanted in his new life is a friend, as the day he was born as a demon king, he shivered in loneliness. As he imagines that he wants to be with a friend to grow together forever, he introduces a celestial fox of rank S in front of him. As soon as the celestial fox appears, she goes on to embrace him while calling him daddy for some reason, and the protagonist feels like it might be strange as he wanted a friend. Then the fox claims that she is Tenko and asks the protagonist to name her, and Marco stops him from naming her right now before he knows more about her. Soon enough, Macro suggests he should enter the world of chaos, where he will be able to test his powers. Tenko uses her cold dance to fight against the spawning beasts, while the protagonist creates a machine gun by using his imagination, which makes her want something similar as well. Then, when Macro moves on, the protagonist notices the excited face of Tenko, wondering if it will be fair to him to create a dungeon and use her to fight against outsiders her whole life, as he didn't create her as a pawn, but rather a friend in the first place. While he imagines how he is about to create a dungeon where they do not have to fight, Macro and her companion think that he will be fine, as the wave is about to go smoothly for them, as the protagonist looks determined to grow as a great demon lord. The next day, the protagonist wakes up as the Demon King Prosel, and he remembers what happened yesterday, which has changed his life. But he still doesn't know what kind of dungeon he should make, as he thinks that he needs to make some options for Tenko so she can make some friends. After reaching the kitchen, he notices that Marco and her companion are both preparing breakfast, and she thinks that she needs to act as his guardian for a while. As he glances in the direction of the food, he notices that the food is already burnt, which feels like some kind of punishment to him, but Macro thinks that he is being rather mean to her for some reason. As a month progresses, Macro starts asking him about how it has been for him, as it is necessary for her to know the progress, and it seems that the upcoming meeting will have all the Demon Kings attending some sort of evening party. The protagonist claims that he was thinking of building some powers before that, and Macro claims that the main objective of the party will be presenting the 10 new demon kings including him, and they will be targeted if they are looked down on. So if he wants to protect Tenko, he will have to demonstrate his strength in the best possible way there. Then the protagonist claims that he has an idea that he can demonstrate by using the skeleton army, and it seems that because of Marco, they decided to go to the Crimson Cave to increase their battle experience for the protagonist and Tenko. The moment they arrive in the cave, Tenko is shocked because of the hot temperature of the area, and it seems to be the dungeon where his crystal is located. It is said that if the crystal shatters, the Demon King will lose power and the monsters will perish, and if the crystal goes out of control, it will continue to spawn hundreds of monsters infinitely just like the Crimson Cave they are in. Suddenly, Tenko's weapon breaks, and she shows it to the protagonist. He notices that using weapons without care will always result in something similar, and he thinks that he will need a new weapon. Then, without even worrying about the reality in front of him, he presents the skeleton army ahead of him, and he claims that he is about to test their practical uses right now, which kind of scares Tenko as they look a little bit scary. As the skeleton army begins to handle the weapons to annihilate the demons ahead of them, the protagonist realizes that it will surely work even though the skeletons are a low-level monster that doesn't even use any metals, so it will be useful to combine them with weapons that he creates. Then when Tenko notices that there are some on the other side, he continues to direct his skeleton army on that side, which ends up causing him huge trouble in the end. After getting back to his residence, Marco wonders how he even managed to survive, and he claims that it wouldn't work properly unless there is a monster that can command the army. After hearing this, Marco gives him an earth metal which has a good affinity with the undead, but Tenko looks rather sad because the skeletons look scary, which feels rather selfish to Marco. The protagonist shuts up Tenko so Marco can continue, and after discussing with her for a while, he ends up creating a human imitation with the creation imitation while getting some knowledge from the time he summoned Tenko. Then the protagonist thinks that he will be creating Tenko's little sister, and after forming 3 metals at once, he ends up creating an elder dwarf, which is surely not an undead. When everyone thinks that the protagonist must be a lolicon, he states that he wants to make Tenko feel welcomed, and she introduces herself in front of her little sister. But even before Tenko is prepared, Elle begins to handle the weapon that was in Tenko's grasp. Elle shoots the weapon, saying that her target is to create a stronger weapon and make more weapons, as it will be bolstering her imagination. The character of Elle is that she is nothing but the master of blacksmithing who is an elder dwarf, and even though the protagonist thought that she would be rather simple, the story around her continued to get stranger in time. But she ended up preparing the whole mine area full of golems, and even though the protagonist and Macro have been trying their best to convince her to become social every now and then, she would only come out to threaten them with her weapons. Then one day, when Macro comes in to guess what day it must be, the protagonist realizes that it must be the evening party where the Demon Kings are said to gather at once, and she presents him the formal wear. She claims that she had to spend a lot of time preparing it so the others wouldn't be able to look down on him, and the protagonist praises Macro, saying that she is also looking rather beautiful. Then, when the protagonist asks about Tenko's dress, she thinks that it must not be necessary for a demon to wear something special, and they wonder about Elle, which confuses both of them. But Tenko claims that they are unable to understand her in the first place, and Elle comes in barging by breaking the walls while rushing in with her companion Golem. Instantly, she claims that she has finished the modification for the desired weapons, increased production, and all the required maintenance, which surprises the protagonist as he made it in such a short amount of time. Not only that, but she also modified the shotgun that Tenko used to use, which is a 4-gauge special. Elle names the gun Izazan-1's, claiming that she can repeatedly fire bullets that can blow someone up instantly. Then when she begins to present everything in front of him, the protagonist realizes that he was thinking about her the wrong way possible, and it seems that it might be the first time in her life that she was able to live up to his expectations. He thanks her for doing her best, and even she ends up calling him daddy for the first time in her life. Instead of thinking about the situation much, the protagonist thinks of getting ready to get out for the evening party, and he thinks that it might be a great opportunity after all, as he could get hints from some older demon kings about dungeon making. Also, he thinks that he will be able to get along nicely with the other demon kings who were born at the same time as him, and thinks of them as his lifelong friends, which feels rather nice to Macro as well. But even before they are able to understand, some monsters end up tying up Tenko with the tails and guards, and it seems that Macro is teaching him a lesson that he must be too naive if he thinks of something like that. While the monsters hold on to him as well, he realizes that they must be the contract monsters of Marco. Suddenly, some voice starts to speak inside of the protagonist's mind at the right time to gather at once, as they end up presenting themselves in the middle of a garden and a blue sky. Then when he finally looks behind after hearing Marco, he notices the Demon King's palace, which reminds him of the truth, even though Marco has been acting frank with him this whole time. The bitter truth of his consciousness starts to reappear in his mind once again as he realizes that the evening party is nothing but a hunting ground, which will act as the crucial first stage for him this time. As the evening party settles down, the protagonist starts meeting with other demon kings and shares his imitations with others to perfuse their acquaintanceship, which makes Marco praise him as he is doing way better than she thought he would do. Even though it might look quite usual to some others, the protagonist could feel some murdering intent from his companion, and he wonders what would happen if Marco wasn't here with him to guide him beforehand. Then when the protagonist asks Marco if the skeleton army is gathering more attention than ever, she thinks that it will be fine as the only people laughing at the skeletons might be inexperienced demon kings in the first place. She thinks that the others who are able to see through Tenko and L should be a danger to him, and she thinks that because of his attractive abilities, people will come to destroy his crystal in order to steal his powers, which should determine who is actually his ally and who isn't, as they will be able to take his metals. As he begins to feel suspicious about everything, he wonders if he can even trust Marco, and everyone begins to praise Tenko for her image and cleverness. While everything is going well, some girl comes in laughing, saying that it must be someone inferior and miserable who brought skeletons as attendants while handling the heads of the skeletons. The protagonist realizes that she is in the same generation as him as well, and he feels rather strange for not being able to see through her identity. When he gets annoyed by her actions, she hands him over a wind medal, which will be able to help him to create some capable companions just like her children. Even Marco realizes that she must be the real deal and wonders what the protagonist is about to do right now to tackle the situation. He thinks of controlling his anger even though she managed to ruin his night, and when he goes on to serve his medal for becoming friends with her, she claims that she wouldn't need it as it must be a failure like him after all. But the protagonist claims that his demons are better than hers, and they both continue to instigate some kind of chaos which causes the voice to start speaking to them once again, as the whole banquet begins to cheer for some kind of entertainment to break the chaos. Soon enough, the voice calls for a war, and it targets the protagonist and Strauss for creating such a nervous environment among each other, and they are presented with the target of dominating against each other. When Marco keeps on getting nervous after seeing the situation, the protagonist thinks that it is all too late to think about his destruction, and thinks that he will be able to get through it by thinking it is a simulation in the White Room. Marco realizes that he must be better than what she thought of him to be, and even though the protagonist knows that he is not trying to place a regular dungeon in the first place, he knows that Strauss will defeat him almost instantly if he keeps on willing to move with his wishes now. He knows that a combat-based dungeon is needed right now, and he doesn't want Tenko and L to be injured, so he thinks of a 3-level dungeon in this place with duplicated places that will be more robust than ever. He thinks of using all of the powers that he already had, which is creation, and also the new 2 abilities achieved from his new foes and allies. After thinking for a while about what he is about to do in his dungeon, he shows his plan to Marco after being excited, which surely doesn't excite everyone at all, other than him of course. As the battle is about to begin, the voice starts describing the rules in front of the protagonist and Strauss, and it is that either they will be destroying the crystal in the depths of the dungeon or defeat the Demon King, who will be standing in the last end of the fight, as the demons used to protect their own dungeon will become the key to victory. Then as soon as the flashy dungeon appears behind Strauss, it starts speaking about her personality, while the protagonist has the simplest of all things, which makes Tenko and L wonder what it is even inside. In front of Strauss's dungeon, there are far too many demons having wind and copy abilities to create clones of each other. The protagonist feels like it must be a lot of work for Strauss, and he only keeps standing after creating a stone cave-like dungeon to stand in front of him, which makes her feel like he must be some trashy guy in the first place, which is why he did something like that. As each side is ready to battle against the other, Tenko asks the protagonist what he is planning for, and he recommends she should keep on watch as something nice is about to happen. It is recommended that if the crystal is destroyed or the Demon King themselves is defeated, they will end up losing, which should be a cliché to protect the crystal in the deepest part of the dungeon. Strauss begins using her spirit by using her wind skill while she keeps on guarding the crystal inside of her dungeon, and she commands her companion Rosalit to prepare an attack. But the most surprising thing is that the protagonist and his team didn't even think of moving an inch while they were heading toward them. Then as she and her companion realize that there is no allowance to fight inside the white space, she realizes that there is not even any way to directly beat the protagonist up, which makes look like he is kind of cheap to begin with. Rosalit also mentions that he doesn't have any kind of intention to defend or attack his enemies in the first place, as if he has no motivation in his life whatsoever. Even so, Strauss decides to send all of the copies and half of the main troops to attack the protagonist as she thinks of invading the enemy base at once and instantly killing them, which will be their ruin. But as soon as the troops begin to enter the entrance, they end up facing a lot of trouble as none of the troops could enter the base all at once, so they would have to limit each other before entering. She thinks that it will be a matter of time before the protagonist loses and thinks of communicating with her troops while using her telepathy magic and announces to send the reinforcements by judging the situation accordingly as she thinks that her enemy is about to lose soon enough. But even after doing so many things, she notices that the protagonist is not moving at all, meaning that there is no contest, and there is no contact from the dungeon, which feels like no response. Without thinking much, Strauss thinks that she will be sending a second squad just to be sure of the guarantee of her team, and begins to wonder what the protagonist is doing despite having so low magical abilities. When Strauss finally enters the dungeon, Tenko and Elle both are surprised to realize that the protagonist can see her, but he explains that the only way he feels is because the dungeon is connected to his consciousness. As soon as she enters the dungeon, she feels like the walls are lined up with a straight line of rocks, and she notices that there are some golems holding something in the middle and deep. When she looks for her soldiers, she notices that the whole dungeon is filled with the blood and rotten figures of her soldiers, which makes her wonder how something managed to happen like this. At that moment, the second squad has already arrived and begins calling for her, and soon enough the golems once again get ready with the miniguns to blast the hell out of her soldiers, and the only thing she can continue to do is watch over her dying soldiers and nothing else. On the other hand, the protagonist begins to feel Strauss's fear and despair inside his mind, and he gets ready with a Glock in his hand to make his turn to attack his enemy. As the situation turns grim for Strauss, she begins to wonder what has happened in the past when she passed as the Demon King under the Demon King of Asteros, and that is how she was born as the King of the Wind. When her time started to get wrong after being born as the Demon King, she wanted to run away multiple times, but she ended up surviving with her companions as they supported her through the tough times so she could become someone to be proud of by never losing to anyone ever in her life. Now she reminds herself why she wanted to become a Demon King for them, but her confidence was truly wrong this whole time, and even though she thought that she would end up pushing with numbers, she ended up failing to confront her enemies. She begins to question the Demon Lord who helped her become a Demon Lord, and she feels like it is rather uncanny that someone inferior to her is able to beat her like this. The Demon Lord starts looking into her dungeon to notice that it includes a gorge, a maze full of pitfall traps, and even a lava zone, which creates a huge diversity. Then when Strauss reminds him that she wasn't asking for his opinion about her own dungeon, he claims that no matter what, she should continue to go on to see through the results as it will become an experience for her in the end. Now that she looks back in the past, she thinks that she might have misunderstood the validity of Astoros, as she shouldn't have taken the protagonist like he is someone who doesn't even deserve to be feared. Just the moment she is about to lose all of her hopes, her companions come to shake her to wake her up by carrying her outside of the protagonist's dungeon. Then her companion claims that she rushed to her the moment she heard her scream and started gathering everyone for her while the protagonist was advancing through theirs. They also acknowledge that seeing the sight of the protagonist's dungeon was nothing but a nightmare, but they think that if they manage to finish off at least one floor, they might have a chance to victory, so instead of copying, she thinks that it will be fine for the real soldiers to enter. Even though her companions say that it will be fine as there is a chance to come back in the war, they propose the idea of scaring the shit out of the protagonist, while calling Strauss the future great Demon King to motivate her even more. After getting her hope back from her comrades, she remarks that there must be some way for her instead of watching her friends die on their own, and she begins to judge through the weaponry of her opponents. Strauss starts counting the formations to deal with the golems. She plans a morbid plan to deal with the enemies and realizes that the further they are the better they will have survival chances, which is probably their last resolve. As they stand in front of the doorway of the dungeon, they think of battling against their enemies with the number of deaths of their comrades and placing a wall of wind against the golems while Rosalit uses her strengthening magic on everyone belonging to the group. On the other hand, she has sent the demons guarding her dungeon as a decoy, which was supposed to play a crucial role in the fraction dividing. When she thinks that as it is trying to decide which to aim for, they will close in, it seems that some kind of trap has unlocked behind them, which makes them realize that all of the decoy troops were killed, so they will be the ones targeted in the end directly. Even when she goes on to use her companions by creating a wall of wind, she realizes that they had no use in front of the weaponry, and the closer she begins to get to the golems, all of her companions continue to die off to the yellow air poisons. One of her companions sacrifices himself to save her from the poison, and even Rosalit ends up dying for her master, so she can leave the rest to her. As soon as Rosalit throws her off of the border of the dangerous place guarded by golems, she falls in front of a door only to notice that there is a huge hallway in front of her along with her last comrade Phobos. Just when she notices that some golems are appearing in front of her once again in the darkness, her heart shatters in an instant, knowing that she is lost after all. On the other hand, when the protagonist reaches the deepest corner of the dungeon of Strauss, he notices that she is already there, and he claims that he was able to course through her feelings for her comrades when she lost them. He asks her to let him finish the crystal so he can end the battle, but she is nowhere ready to let him win as all of her friends are dead in the course of action. She instantly uses her dragon medal with her ace to win against him, so she would be able to compensate for everyone's death, while presenting the synthesized Emerald Dragon, which will act as the genuine final battle for her to feel the peace in the end. Then, as the trump card of Strauss is revealed, everyone starts to amaze after seeing that she was able to create some sort of demon like that, and they claim that even though the protagonist was doing well, he would be having difficulties soon, which even gets Marco tensed about him. It seems that the Emerald Dragon is some sort of jade dragon made by combining wind and the dragon metals together, which only gains power through berserk in exchange for intellect, with the ability of surpassing S-rank demons. But instead of being nervous about the whole situation, he commences the part of the plan by commencing combat, and all of them begin to shoot directly at the dragon, which Elle realizes that it is not even working at all after some time. But knowing that there is a way to win the war without even defeating the Demon King or destroying the crystal that reserves the source power means that there is no need to go against the monster directly. When Tenko goes on to look for Strauss, she notices that she is gone, and it seems that the crystal was swallowed by the dragon while it was being created, so there is no way for them to win the war without defeating the dragon, which is fixed. Both Elle and the protagonist get knocked out on the wall, so Tenko decides to use her weapon against the dragon, which ends up being no use no matter how many times she decides to shoot it. Then the monster ends up blasting her away from its close proximity, and the moment she falls down on the ground, the protagonist gets rather tense about her situation. None of them are able to realize what is happening as none of their attacks are going through at all, as the monster is wearing an armor of wind which is blocking the powers of the bullets. Then Elle claims that using the shotgun's true power might be the better option for her, and all of them leave the duty of annihilating the monster to Tenko's hand. At the same time, the protagonist is in awe as he never realized that the shotgun would have a full auto function, and Elle explains that she didn't want to use it, but has to know as there is no way to survive in front of the monster. The hope of penetrating the armor keeps on driving Tenko in the worst way possible, and the monster ends up throwing the heaviest test on her as she is about to approach it. They once again realize that they are not about to get close that easily, and the moment they begin to think about what to do, the bloody body of Tenko gets thrown at him. Then in the dire situation, Elle asks the protagonist to give Tenko a name as they cannot win like this anymore, and thinks that if she ends up becoming a contracted demon, they might have a way to make it happen. But Tenko claims that there is no way it will happen as she made a promise to him, which reminds the protagonist of the past when Marco reminded him of his duties properly. But after seeing her loyalty to him, he realizes that he is ready to give her a name and gives her the name of Kuina and asks her to show the trust that he had to put in her to win against the direst situations. Then Tenko, with her newfound identity, begins to work as Kuina to show him that she is the best demon that has ever lived. The idea of having a name on the contracted demon is to get them a lot of powers, which allows the demons to fight for their masters on a whole different level. The idea of her having powers crossed so much in her that she ended up gaining more powers than the Emerald Dragon after reaching her adult form, and she thanks El for granting her such a powerful weapon, and she begins shooting at the monster deliberately. Then as soon as the monster begins to vanish, all of the Demon Kings, including Marco, are surprised to see that the protagonist has surpassed their expectations, and the final golden dance made by Kuina ends up shattering through the crystal ball holding the magical powers of Strauss. In the end, the protagonist gets announced to be the winner of the war, and Marco holds him close to make him realize that he has outdone himself this time for real. When the protagonist shuts her down saying that it is a public place, the protagonist claims that it wasn't just him who worked to win the battle, as there were two fairies helping through the whole battle, and they are El and Kuina. Also, the protagonist claims that Marco is the one who keeps on advising him through everything. When Marco notices that Strauss is coming in their way, she claims that she is about to get some air, and both the protagonist and Strauss can continue to spend some time together to patch up whatever they need to talk about. Then, after thinking for a while, Strauss finally apologizes to the protagonist for behaving like a madwoman in the evening party for looking down on him. Instead of mocking her for having weak battalions against him, he keeps on praising her for having so many great soldiers and even the strongest dragon beside her to fight for her, and claims that he was glad that she was his first opponent, while insisting that he wants to be friends with her. Strauss realizes that he must be a great guy in the first place, and realizes that she needs to accept it as well, so she apologizes to him once again, as she is glad to be defeated by him. She also accepts him as a friend, and Astaros comes in to guide them both, hoping that his daughter will continue to grow even further from here. He lends the protagonist the original dragon medal, and even a pigeon demon, so he can send letters to Strauss, and Strauss comes in to let him have the original wind medal, as she will be writing a lot of letters to him. Then when the protagonist thinks about what has happened until now, Astaros claims that Marco must be proud of him for having her last job in her life. The word last ends up shocking him, as he finds it hard to believe that Marco only has less than 1 year right now, which makes him rush through the corridors until he is finally able to reach her. As she begins to question his raising voice, he begins asking her why she did not think of telling him everything from the beginning, and he wonders if she is really about to disappear even though she is healthy and fine. Even though she is surely to die after a year, she thinks that she is doing great for the fact that it is the last task she will ever have, so she can disappear without even worrying. She goes on to ask him if he grasped any ideas in the evening party, and claims that the dungeon he is about to create is a city that will surely not hurt any of his friends, which he once again has realized after seeing someone's despair of losing their important friends. The protagonist thinks that instead of having despair and sadness, he will be serving happiness and hope while using dungeon feelings as a source. After hearing him out, Marco thinks that she wouldn't even dream of hearing something like this, and she thinks that it will be the most peaceful moment of her life, as she will be able to continue to watch him over as his parents until she finally reaches the age to perish on her own, and she names the protagonist as the Demon King of Town Planning. Then after a while, the protagonist seems to be quite tense when Marco comes in to ask him about the process of the dungeon city making, and he seems to be borrowing Marco's library to search for things, but he is unable to make pointers on how to make a dungeon, but nothing he knows is about how to make a city. Then when he thinks that he is unable to go through every book alone, he realizes that it would have been helping if Kuina and El were able to help him, but they are busy doing their own tasks of sleeping or browsing. Then Marco gets the idea of checking a city directly, which brings all of them in front of a huge city, which is the commercial city Aklaba, and he thinks that it will be working as a perfect reference city for him to move with it. But the moment he goes on to approach the city with his companions, people continue to shoot arrows at them, which is a normal reaction for the citizens to have for bringing in demons in a city. Then he realizes that he has some clothes to create perfect disguises for them, which were given by Marco. Even after having the clothes, it was kind of an issue for Kuina's ears, so she begins to transform in a different way to solve the issue. Then after arriving inside the city, the protagonist is amazed to see the industrial structures, while Kuina and El look like they are on the edge of finishing off a great number of people if possible, as they make them feel impulsive. Suddenly, some weirdos come in to haggle with them, saying that he might have found some chicks and thinks that Elle and Kuina might be working in some kind of brothels. Then when he claims that he is the one accompanying them, the guys continue to tease him, saying a lot of different things, and when one of the huge chest adventurers comes in, the guys continue to chase her, which gets Elle and Kuina on the edge once again. The protagonist realizes that they might be adventurers for sure, as they are speaking about earning in a dungeon, and notices that they are raiding the Demon King of Time's dungeon north of the city. It is said that the time-controlling demon is probably the strongest, as he is able to turn back time and even revive whoever is needed, and he has the dungeon which is of high difficulty and impregnable and can get someone a lot of treasure. After thinking about everything that the Demon King has done for the city, they think of going to the Demon King of Time, as there is no downside to establishing friendships. But as they continue to walk to reach his place, all of them continue to get tired after a while, as they keep on walking for a long time, over 80 kilometers. At night, they notice that other adventurers are camping, and they think of creating tents as well, and some guy thinks that the protagonist must be weird for not having any kind of equipment to raid the dungeon. The man begins asking the protagonist if he would like to buy anything from him, and the idea of having a merchant in front of him kind of blows his mind. The man states that he is the biggest commercial firm in Iklaba, which is the Kurdord company, as he is responsible for selling to those who head toward the dungeon of the Demon King. While he explains that he is providing the best price, the protagonist begins to look through his speech to see if he is truly speaking right or not. Then the man explains that time is heavier than price here, as no one would have any choice but to buy from him, which gives him some room to exploit them at once, and the protagonist realizes that he must be rather greedy to do something like this. Even though the conversation really takes him nowhere, the protagonist feels like it must be unfathomable even till the end. The next day, when they arrive in front of the dungeon, they notice that there are a lot of merchants, including the one who met them yesterday, as they have the same idea of exploiting them. As soon as they enter the door, they notice that everyone is busy fighting, which is nothing but pure chaos inside of the dungeon, and as they begin to walk into the dungeon, the protagonist notices that everyone has stopped, even the chaos around them. Soon enough, they teleport straight up in front of the Demon King, and he claims that he heard of him looking for him from Marco, so he ends up inviting him by stopping the time, as the man named Dantalion comes face to face with them all. The protagonist knows that Dantalion is one of the strongest demon kings living in this world right now, and he claims that he remembers the protagonist from the evening party as he went against Strauss. As he begins serving his gift to the Demon King, he reminds the protagonist that he was given permission, just like others, to create dungeons and to participate in wars, so he is interested in knowing what kind and what the dungeon will really be in the first place. Then Kuina comes in, saying that they were wandering to see through that, and the protagonist warns her as she is being rude, and the protagonist claims that he has already chosen the place where the dungeon will be, which kind of surprises Dantalion. He then claims that his dungeon will be between the commercial city of Iklaba and the dungeon of Dantalion, the Demon King of Time, which spooks him out. When the protagonist explains that adventurers from Iklaba are his main customers, as marking the whole city as his territory, Dantalion remarks that in that way the protagonist will be going against him. When everyone notices that he has already appeared behind them, the protagonist tries his best to make him realize that he is not trying to go against him by ruining his profit, and as he is about to explain more about it, he claims that he was just kidding by appearing behind them and nothing else. Dantalion then adds that he has already heard of the whole planning from Marco beforehand, as he and Marco are from the same year. He claims that the protagonist can do whatever he wants to do, and thinks that if it is a city, there shouldn't be any dispute over adventurers. But he has a condition, since the protagonist is trying to gain profit inside his territory, and the compensation will be the creation medal, which holds the ability to create as many S-ranked demons as possible if needed. Now, the protagonist understands what Marco was meaning by saying that a lot of people are noticing him because of his powers, as they are curious, and Dantalion claims that he will be able to shift somewhere else if he wants. The protagonist thinks that he will be fine and thinks of giving his medal to Dantalion, as it wouldn't be wise to get into trouble with someone like him right now, as he will benefit from having a dungeon close to him as well. Kuina thinks that it will be heavily dangerous to keep someone like him close to him, and thinks that it will be fine as he will die at the same age as Marco, so he can keep himself safe by lying low for the time being. As he agrees to his proposition, the protagonist begins to ask Dantalion how he managed to get a hold of Marco, and he appears out of nowhere to let him know that he is very jealous of the protagonist. Dantalion keeps asking the protagonist various questions relating to Marco as he isn't even able to hold her hands, and he gets relieved after hearing that the protagonist doesn't have any kind of relationship with her. Then when the protagonist thinks of saying everything to Marco about what has happened, he ends up giving his time and water medal as a thanks for his creation medal, more like a bribe to shut the protagonist up from relaying that information to Marco. In the end, it feels like a good expedition to the protagonist as they were able to get permission to build a city and have an ally like Dantalion. Then as they begin to move on, Dantalion ends up asking if he is surely thinking of building a city in the space where he thinks that he will be able to build, as the whole place is nothing but a poison swamp. After researching for a while, he knows that there is no way it is about to be possible, no matter how hard he tries to make it happen, as he wouldn't be able to overwrite the map. Then when he is asked where he wants to settle down, he thinks that it will be more likely better to be in the middle, and thinks of making a city in the midpoint of two places, as it would be a viable option for the adventurers as well. He thinks that he is thinking about something reasonable after being informed by the merchant whom he met yesterday. When he begins to research more about materials and his gifts that he received from Dantalion, he notices a communicant device from Strauss has arrived to leave him some kind of letter, as she is concerned about his condition and situation. After reading through the letter, he realizes that he will be able to use her powers for this one, and as he goes through the letter, he notices that she wanted him to warn him about something, including an invitation. After synthesizing for a while with all of his powers at once, he ends up creating an ancient elf who specializes in nature and hopes that the problem they have will be solved nicely. But even before he is about to fathom it, he realizes that he has made a unique one once again who is eager to lick all of his companions. After some time, she begins purifying the whole swamp, which improves the quality of the nature around them, and the city's foundation gets ready in an instant, which surprises them all at once. When the protagonist is back inside Marco's dungeon, she comes in to ask to see how his progress of making a dungeon is going on right now, and she is also surprised by the fact that he didn't create any trouble for them, which is ironic. As he claims that he is surely building a city, Marco understands that he wasn't kidding when he said that he wants to build a city and asks if he is about to leave her dungeon the same day. It seems that the protagonist is ready to leave as Elle and Kuina both are helping him, and hope that he will be done building his dungeon soon enough to plant the crystal in the deepest core of his dungeon. Now he also knows that he cannot just move his crystal whenever he wants to, which will be acting as the permanent base for his dungeon, as there is no guarantee that no one will attack the dungeon when he is out of the dungeon. Marco realizes that her dungeon will be empty right now without them and asks if the raven is what he got from Dantalion. It seems that he gave him the raven to use for surveillance, as he would want to act as the security of the area for being in the area for a while as a leader. The protagonist is glad to make him realize that he is not a threat to him, even though he is still hiding some things that he wants to keep secret. Marco proposes the idea of setting a teleportation circle in her dungeon as well, so he would be able to come as soon as he wanted, and he thinks of bidding farewell to Marco as they are ready to leave. Marco claims that there are a lot of things she would like for him to have, but as a parent demon, her activities are limited because of the complications, but the protagonist thinks that he has already received a lot from her. Then, before bidding farewell to her, he gives her a diamond that will endlessly emit glisters to make him remember the memories they had together, which almost makes her cry. Then as a present, Marco ends up kissing the protagonist, which gets him flustered, and the Demon King of Time gets jealous of the situation. Suddenly, Marco takes him onto the bed, and he ends up refusing her invitation to do something like that as they need to go on soon enough. Then he claims that as soon as his city is ready, he will end up inviting her, and the whole farewell feels rather harsh to Marco as she keeps on looking at the diamond given by the protagonist. As soon as he arrives in the middle of the area, he starts constructing his dungeon while placing his crystal in the middle and thinks of doing the same thing as he had done at the evening party. While building the dungeon, he also thinks of a water source and producing the cover for the first floor to make a mine, which ends up finishing the basics of the dungeon. After a while, they realize that the buildings have to be done by them, no matter what, even if the crystal creates the basic infrastructure, and they all begin to work hard to produce their first buildings to complete the city. After working for a while on their own, the protagonist thinks of having lunch with everyone as all of them are tired, and they soon realize that they do not have enough manpower to do the work on their own, even though they have golems and summon demons. Even after going through all of them and their working abilities, the protagonist realizes that there is no way it is about to be done when they think that it will be done, and at the same time, he doesn't have any dungeon points to create more demons. The protagonist now understands that it is way harder than what he has expected, and he quickly summons the skeleton army, which can solve the manpower problem they have right now. But soon enough the whole plan fails, as they are quite frail, and they even keep on slowing them down. The protagonist notices that he has a death imitation medal, which he received from his first ally at the evening party, so he begins summoning humans and death to synthesize at once, which ends up creating a skeletal figure named White, who is a duke in the underworld. The protagonist senses a high sense of intelligence, even though White is in a low rank, and he asks if he can understand what the skeletons are saying right now, so he can guide them to construct a city for them. White claims that he can do that, and starts showing a demo of his powers as the skeletons start to work on their own to prove something really unexpected. White begins to ask the protagonist about what his intentions are as he is trying to build a city, and the protagonist claims that he is targeting to make something different where no one will have to fight each other. After hearing him, White begins explaining the slightest explanation that one can have about having a grudge against the humans, which reminds the protagonist of Kuina and L's reaction in the middle of the city against the citizens, and remarks that the protagonist must be a kind person. After hearing the protagonist and his words, White once again pledges his loyalty to him, as he has acknowledged him as a true king, which confuses the hell out of Kuina and L. White starts working with his skeleton army, and the knowledge he has is undeniable about architecture and city building, which makes the protagonist feel like he is watching a second leader who is getting along with Kuina and L pretty nicely. They ended up making a huge selling point for the city as well by creating a water source, and started preparing their city for the final stage in the end. As the infrastructure of the city is completed, all of them are ecstatic to see that they are only getting close to their final example. And as the housing is also completed, the elves have been blessing the fields so the applicants can start moving in. Kuina worries if the humans are even about to take a look in their direction, as they weren't doing so before when she started detecting for her own research, and the protagonist thinks that if they are able to decloak at the same time as they open the city, they will start to notice to come over to them in the first place. As the work is done, the protagonist and the others think of having their lunch under a tree, which is the apple tree the protagonist made by using his creation metal, and they even continue to grow various crops as well. Kuina and El both love the apples, and even White feels like there is no way he would be able to forget the taste of the apple that he is eating right now, which inspires the protagonist to be confident of his skills that he will succeed. Then when it comes to naming the city for the final output, the protagonist names the city to be Avalon, the city of hope and smiles. The next morning, a random adventure party begins to have a tough time escaping from the fight, and while one of their teammates continues to beg for his life, one of them notices a city ahead of them which feels rather new to them. When they finally enter the store of city, all of the adventurers notice that Kuina is shrieking so everyone can continue to work faster, as she is already having a lot of trouble working. They realize that she must be quite nervous and notice that the whole city is kind of flourishing in a great way as they start getting guided by Elle in case they want to buy something. Even though it has been only half a day for the protagonist and the others, the city has a lot more people than they expected in the beginning, and the protagonist starts looking through the review of the city as the adventurers are enjoying the city. They begin to love everything in the city, starting from the natural and artificial food to even weapons made by Elle. And the protagonist comes in to say that the city is a habitat for coexisting for everyone and every race, as he thanks them for coming in. He even asks them to hang out with him for a while so he could show them around, and White almost ends up scaring the hell out of them while visiting the inn as he begins explaining the inn's packages to purchase. They even hang around the onsen, which ends up surprising them even more. And as the adventurers begin to think about money, the protagonist realizes that he needs to find some way so they can earn some money for a short amount of time. Sometimes later, Kuina comes in tired, saying that the crowd is a bit too much for her to handle and thinks of making more subordinates, and the adventurers claim that if he is that short-staffed, he can surely be able to hire them. Then the idea of a part-time job comes into his mind, which also relieves the adventurers, so they do not have to go back to their city to have fun or earn money. Both White and the protagonist are glad to see that they are doing really well for the start, and when White warns him to be cautious about the crowd, he begins to think of giving a pro-service industry which will allow them to grow even more. As he gets outside, he thinks of getting one of the experienced merchants on his side, and one of the greedy merchants continues to make his way into the city of the protagonist for a quick inspection, of course. The next day, the situation gets even worse as the items begin to go out of stock, and the demand continues to rise each and every second, and the adventurers who came to work as part-timers begin to rescue Elle and Kuina from the trouble they were having all this time. Both Elle and Kuina realize that the humans are pretty experienced at something like this, as they are even helping them to cope with their service. When they end up gossiping at the back of the store, one of them ends up seeing Kuina's real face, which ends up revealing to her that she isn't actually a human, and thinks that they must have been Fox demi-humans, not big of an issue for someone to begin with. People get wild in the crowd, knowing that they are demi-humans having their cute bodies, and Kuina and Elle both realize that they can think of humans are more than just dungeon food, which is shedding a new light in their viewpoint. The girl asks them for the antique sword as a reward, which they have to refuse as it is not supposed to be sold in the first place, as if it is a reward of a lifetime. Then one of the big guys comes in saying that they will go out to raid Dantalion's dungeon, and meanwhile, the whole store is now out of stock of every item. Then the idea of Kuina having a special name begins to raise questions in Elle's mind and wonders when the protagonist will be able to accept her. Soon enough, when White meets her, he claims that he is ready to listen to her if she wants to say something, and the merchant reaches out to them to meet the protagonist. The man introduces himself as Kanana Kurtrudo, who is one of the working merchants of Iklaba, and the man is accompanied by the greedy merchant they all met before creating the dungeon. The man begins asking the protagonist where he gets new varieties of items that he has never seen before, and White keeps a lookout to make sure that the protagonist is doing well. As soon as the protagonist claims that wholesaling the wares from his city to the outside or sharing their trade secrets will be declined, as he knew that they would have been trying something like that, and the merchant claims that the protagonist would have to teach them the method of manufacture the sword, so they will be paying 1 gold coin for every sword sold. After listening to their offer, the protagonist claims that he is not about to accept that, and claims that he will be ready to support them to open a business in his city, which will be duty-free while having one house for free at the same time. The protagonist also claims that he will be giving a golem and a horse if he needs transportation only for the merchant to develop the city. But when the man is about to accept the offer, the greedy merchant comes in to say that this whole city is quite suspicious, which pretty much shakes up the whole deal.